With 2 world wars behind them and an access to a stream of information, Gen Z, born between 1997 and 2012, was a generation with seemingly great expectations and hope. However, ask almost any member of this generation, and you will find a lack of meaning and a pessimism that runs deep within them. We find higher rates of major depressive episodes, higher rates of suicide, and increasing distress about humanity. What accounts for such a change? There's a widespread meme of a character called the Doomer. The Doomer depicts a person who has basically given up on life. This character's relatability and popularity are a testament to our generation's pessimism. Holding the belief that humanity is doomed has recently been coined Doomerism. In a 2021 study conducted regarding the government's response to climate change, more than half of the world's people say that humanity is doomed. There are a couple components I want to address to this. So, to try to understand growing pessimistic tendencies as well as the relatability of a negative outlook, we're going to refer to Arthur Schopenhauer, sometimes labeled as the philosopher of pessimism. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, quote, "Life swings like a pendulum, backwards and forward, between pain and boredom." A certain relatability in his pessimism is a big part of why his philosophy became very famous. We can all relate to having feelings of despair and moments of hopelessness. Schopenhauer believed that we were products of our unconscious will. The will for Schopenhauer is an insatiable unconscious desire to survive and maintain our species. Whether it is to find food, reproduce, or maintain relationships, we are all a product of this unconscious driving force called the will. One of the main themes in his work is that the will or unconscious urges are primary and the intellect is secondary. For Schopenhauer, this realization that we are slaves to our unconscious desire is a testament to how truly sad our existence is. However, he thought that the will was to be rejected. Quote, "The hinge of his philosophy is the ethical assertion that will is evil and must be denied." His pessimism runs deeper still. Schopenhauer says, quote, "We continue our life with great interest and much solicitude as long as possible, just as we blow out a soap bubble as long and as large as possible, although with the perfect certainty that it will burst." This was what life was like to Schopenhauer. You can try in life, you can try in your dreams, but your aspirations will fail, just like a bubble.
Flew them as high as they could go until they popped like balloons. They popped like balloons. It was crazy.
No matter what you think about Schopenhauer, his pessimistic outlook on life can be a foundation for what a lot of people feel in this generation. They can try all they want, but in the end, they are pawns to a system, or the unconscious will. Oscar Wilde's quote comes to mind, quote, "To live is the rarest thing in the world. Most people exist. That is all." A lot of people in Generation Z feel this way, that humanity is doomed. History will repeat itself. As the author of Kafka on the Shore said, "There will be no war to end all wars. There will be no time when humans do not fight over something. Humanity is doomed." To understand this shift from optimism to pessimism in this generation, I want to ask the question, what happened? Now, Gen Z grew up in the digital age, or the age of television. And I think this doomeristic attitude has a lot to do with the media in this generation. One way of understanding media is to think that it has the function of a metaphor or an analogy. Now, what is the function of an analogy or a metaphor? Well, it is to bridge one unknown concept with a known concept. For example, if I don't know what a castle is, I can explain what a castle is in terms of analogy. It's like a house, but it has fortified defenses for guarding the house, or something like that. The function of media can be understood as an analogy for us, the viewer, to understand reality. It has the same job of bridging the unknown, or the reality of the world, with the known, or our current knowledge of the world. That leads us directly into my question. What happens when the medium by which we receive is corrupted? What happens if the analogy is bad? What's important to remember about media is that it's fundamentally a business to keep you coming back. So when you hear the news of something terrible happening in the world, you are incentivized to come back. The unknown reality is far too interesting, and you realize that your knowledge is insufficient, and media is the way you hope to bridge that gap. At least, that's what you might think. However, the news is more like a form of entertainment nowadays, rather than actually informing the user. Neil Postman says in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, quote, Americans no longer talk to each other. They entertain each other. They do not exchange ideas. They exchange images. They do not argue with propositions. They argue with good looks, celebrities, and commercials. Let's take, for example, the war in Ukraine. Whatever your stance on it, the role of news becomes a lot more apparent with this one question. What steps do you plan on taking to fight against it? Additionally, in the age of television, happiness does not sell well. We have a negativity bias as humans. A bias to focus on negative things, that is. John Stuart Mill, for example, says, quote, "I have observed that not the man who hopes when others despair, but the man who despairs when others hope, is admired by a large class of persons as a sage." Additionally, a study published in 2019 said the following, quote, "To be clear, this study directly demonstrates that humans around the world are more activated by negative news coverage. Companies have to sell you what you lack. That in itself might not be a bad thing, but at its extreme, when it makes the customers start hating themselves, you can see how it would get dangerous. The advent of social media makes it seem like everyone has a better life than you. Social media plays on your biological urge to want more, and the constant comparison of yourself to other people is good for business. It's no wonder that there is an entire generation that is insecure because they have to compare themselves to unrealistic standards. But that's not all. News also teaches us some form of learned helplessness. In psychology, believing our behavior is irrelevant in the face of challenges is called learned helplessness, which has been connected with low performance and a higher likelihood of depression. When we see something like the 9/11 attack or the war in Ukraine, and we are shown tragedies beyond our comprehension, what can we do? Absolutely nothing. To quote further from the Harvard Business Review, quote, "We believe that negative news influences how we approach our work and the challenges we encounter at the office because it shows us a picture of life in which our behavior does not matter. The majority of news stories showcase problems in our world that we can do nothing about." So, in my opinion, a combination of unwillingness to combat social challenges due to learned helplessness, social issues left by previous generations, existential loneliness, and the hyper-competitive nature of media, along with the existence of TikTok, is why a lot of Gen Z is pessimistic, I think. Now, I'm not trying to demonize news or social media companies. They kind of have to do this because to stay alive, they need viewership. However, it is just important to keep in mind that what media sells is people's attention. In other words, the product is you. Also, privacy with big tech now. We're not going to talk about that, but that's also a huge thing. Okay, we covered a lot, mostly having to do with pessimism and media. Now, I want to explore the philosophical side of things, of why this generation is so hopeless.
Oh my God! Oh jeez! Oh my God! Oh,
It's no secret that postmodernism has become famous over the years. Although postmodernism is practically undefinable, we just need to get the gist of it for the sake of this video. Quote, "Simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as the incredulity or disbelief towards meta-narratives. Meta-narratives are something like science, religion, or rationality, things that basically establish a firm foundation and an explanation of reality. Postmodernism, at least in some parts, tries to deconstruct these grand narratives. Now, I don't think postmodernism is all bad, but I think it does have its vices. Its lack of contribution to meaning is apparent to me. It's no wonder then why we find so many doomers within this generation. Couple of things that I thought was a very interesting characterization of the relevance of postmodernism is shift from objectivity to subjectivity, from sincerity to irony, and from faith to skepticism. Generally, through the 1900s, especially the time of boomers or baby boomers, there was a lot of claims of objectivity, and maybe something was an actual objective truth. One product of this was many following the meta-narrative of religion. However, as I alluded to in my last video, following 9/11, we see the deconstruction of this grand narrative, and with the loss of traditional values in objectivity, we enter into a world where subjectivity is upheld to some degree. Through this, we also see the rise of skepticism. Along with the decrease in objectivity and belief in subjectivity, we also see a shift from sincerity to irony. That is to say, a great distinction of this generation to other generations is their use of irony. One distinguishing feature of Gen Z is their use of meta-irony. Now, this concept comes from this video, but essentially, meta-irony is irony that has so many layers that you can't tell what they're actually sincere about. For example, if I say that I love eating dogs, you might think I'm joking. Then, what if I say I'm Asian and I'm serious about this? I love eating dogs. What are you supposed to think about my stance on the matter? If you haven't noticed, Gen Z does this a lot, especially when they're making jokes. And with the hopelessness that came from national events like this one or that one or this one or maybe that, Gen Z's humor has also a dark edge to them. That's why older generations are worried about Gen Z, because they lack a level of sincerity when they're making jokes. Gen Z jokes about the craziest things, like memes about school shootings or World War III after Trump ordered the assassination of the Iranian president, and many, many more. But there is a danger when memes become completely ambiguous. Wow, I can't believe I said that, okay. Memes were originally coined by the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. This definition has been completely hijacked now, but it's supposed to mean a unit of cultural imitation. In other words, it is the transmission of ideas, information, style, etc. without the passing of genes. But what happens when an idea that is being transmitted is using meta-irony? We start to transmit ideas that have entirely ambiguous meanings. In other words, we begin to say nothing to anyone about anything. Although irony and skepticism are cool and all, they are entirely negative concepts. That is to say, they deconstruct, but they do not rebuild. I don't think that postmodernism is the wicked witch of the West, but I think the lack of contribution to meaning from postmodernism is to be taken seriously. Without getting into the philosophical terminology, I think, at least in some part, we have to return back to sincerity. Okay, let's be real for a second. Schopenhauer was not a good person. People often use their pessimism to justify their negative and cynical behavior. Schopenhauer is the most elegant pessimist to put a pen to paper, but even the greatest pessimist could not have a meaningful life with this kind of attitude. Contrary to what he preaches in his philosophy, he himself could not reject the will. Quote, "He habitually dined well at good restaurants. He had menial trivial love affairs which were sensual but not passionate. He was exceedingly quarrelsome and unusually avaricious. It is hard to find in his life any virtue except kindness to animals. In all other respects, he was completely selfish." Now, this is obviously not an attack on his philosophy, but rather what usually comes from this doomeristic attitude towards the world. I think the doomer's attitude, and consequently most of Gen Z's attitude, comes from hopelessness. Because the promises of an American dream started to die out, and we saw that naive optimism was not working so well, we opted for something that we believe to be a rational pessimism. However, I think there is a better option. Pessimism or cynicism has a flaw. If I say that reading books is stupid, I never have to read again. I never have to be wrong. If you don't try, by definition, you cannot be wrong. If you label an entire group as monkeys and just stupid, you don't have to engage with their ideas. You hear hate towards the government, you hear hate towards the left or the right, but what does that do? It limits your sphere of knowledge, so you don't have to feel the pain of losing again. Oscar Wilde, I think, put it quite elegantly. Quote, "A cynic is a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing." In other words, pessimists know the downside of everything, but they don't know the upside of anything. Now, you might have already guessed, but I think our stance on the matter should not be a rational pessimism, but rather a rational optimism. An optimism that is not naive in its approach, not saying that it'll blindly get better for sure, because we don't know that. However, if we look to the past, things have gotten much, much better overall. And this is a consistent theme in history. For example, in his book, The Rational Optimist, Matt Ridley gives numerous examples of how society has become unfathomably greater than before. The first example I thought very well depicts our progress as a species is the fact that, quote, in monetary terms, the same amount of artificial light cost 20,000 times much in England in the year 1300 as it does today. A couple other examples are the growing of trust among people, increase in free time, and the advent of many medical devices. So to end this video off on a positive note, let's not romanticize living in the past where there were uncured diseases and all sorts of things we take for granted in the present. The rational optimist says to himself, hey, it's hard to hope, but let's do it anyways, because it's the rational thing to do. I was going to give an example of how we can stay rationally optimistic towards AI, but this video's, I think, 20 minutes, and AI is a whole nother beast. So that's the end of the video. Have a beautiful day, predict the future, bye bye.